There are moments in life when everyone counts you out, when society decides your story is already written and your best days are behind you, when whispers and laughter follow you down the street like shadows you cannot escape. This is the story of such a woman, living in the harsh judgment of a frontier town in 1878, and the extraordinary moment when everything the gossips believed was proven wrong. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and at 40 years old she had become the subject of endless speculation and mockery in the small Wyoming town of Silver Falls. She was the spinster, the old maid, the woman who had somehow failed at the one thing society said women must do, which was find a husband before time ran out. But what the townspeople did not understand was that Eleanor had not failed at anything. She had simply been waiting, though she did not know what for, until the day a mysterious mountain man came down from the high peaks and changed everything. This is the story of how the woman everyone pitied became the one everyone envied, how patience proved wiser than desperation, and how true worth reveals itself to those with eyes clear enough to see it. Eleanor Hayes had lived in Silver Falls her entire life, the daughter of the town's doctor who had passed away 10 years earlier, leaving her the small house on Maple Street and enough money to live modestly if she was careful. Eleanor had never been beautiful in the way that made men stumble over their words. Her features were pleasant but plain, her figure average, her brown hair streaked with gray that she made no effort to hide. In her youth, there had been a few suitors, men who courted her with varying degrees of interest, but none of them had felt right to Eleanor. She had watched her friends rush into marriages with men who seemed wrong for them, had seen how many of those marriages turned into prisons of disappointment and regret. Eleanor had decided early that she would rather be alone than trapped with the wrong person, and she had stuck to that decision even as the years passed and society's judgment grew heavier. By the time she reached 40, the whispers had turned to open mockery. Women decades younger than Eleanor would smile with false sweetness and ask if she was still hoping for a husband, their voices dripping with the satisfaction of their own married status. Men looked through her as if she had become invisible, no longer even registering as female once she passed the invisible expiration date society placed on women's worth. Eleanor supported herself by taking in sewing and mending, her skilled fingers creating beautiful embroidery and delicate repairs that kept her fed and housed. She lived quietly, tending her small garden and reading books from her father's collection, finding contentment in simple pleasures even as loneliness sometimes pressed against her chest like a weight. She had made peace with her life, or so she told herself, accepting that marriage and children were not part of her story. The townspeople of Silver Falls saw Eleanor as a cautionary tale, a warning to young girls about what happened when you were too picky or too proud or simply too unlucky to catch a husband before your youth faded. The particularly cruel ones said Eleanor had deserved her fate, that her refusal of several perfectly acceptable proposals in her 20s proved she thought too highly of herself. The kinder ones simply pitied her, which somehow felt worse than the mockery, because at least mockery acknowledged she existed. Eleanor bore it all with quiet dignity, holding her head high as she walked to the general store or attended church, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her broken by their judgment. Everything changed on a bright October morning when a stranger rode into Silver Falls leading a packed train loaded with furs and goods that made the whole town buzz with excitement. The man was called simply Stone, though some said his full name was Jonathan Stone, and he was a legend in the territory. Stone was a mountain man who had discovered gold in the high peaks 15 years earlier and had been quietly mining it ever since, becoming wealthy beyond most people's imagination while living alone in the wilderness. He came to town only once or twice a year to trade his furs and gold for supplies, and every time he appeared, the whole town went into a frenzy. Stone was in his mid-40s, tall and powerfully built, with black hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered from years in the mountains, but handsome in a rough, masculine way that made women forget their manners and stare openly. More importantly, Stone was rich, possibly the richest man in the entire territory, and he was unmarried. Every single woman in Silver Falls, and for 50 miles around, had set her cap for Stone at one time or another, but he had never shown interest in any of them, conducting his business and disappearing back into the mountains without so much as a second glance at even the prettiest girls who positioned themselves in his path. This particular visit seemed like all the others as Stone dealt with the merchants and bankers, his manner polite but distant, his eyes focused on completing his business and returning to the solitude he preferred. The saloon girls tried their charms on him and failed. The young beauties of respectable families arranged to cross his path accidentally and were barely acknowledged. The widows and divorcees made their availability known and were ignored. Stone seemed completely uninterested in female company, which only made him more desirable and mysterious to everyone watching. Eleanor paid no attention to the commotion Stone's arrival created because she had learned long ago not to waste time on futile hopes. She was in the general store buying thread when Stone walked in to purchase supplies, and Eleanor was so focused on choosing the right color that she did not notice the way the room went silent or the way Stone stopped in his tracks when he saw her. She was examining a spool of blue thread, holding it up to the light from the window to check the shade, completely unaware that the legendary mountain man was staring at her like he had seen something that took his breath away. Stone approached the counter where Eleanor stood and asked the shopkeeper a question about the thread Eleanor was holding, something about its strength and durability. Eleanor looked up, mildly annoyed at being interrupted, and found herself meeting the intense gaze of the most striking man she had ever seen. She answered his question directly and honestly, explaining the difference between various thread weights and their uses with the confidence of someone who knew her craft. Stone listened like her words were poetry, asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest in what she was saying. The shopkeeper and the other customers watched in stunned silence as Stone and Eleanor discussed sewing techniques and fabric qualities for nearly 15 minutes, their conversation flowing naturally as if they were old friends. When Eleanor finished her purchase and turned to leave, Stone asked her name. She told him, and he repeated it slowly like he was memorizing something precious. He asked if she was the Eleanor Hayes who did mending and embroidery, and when she confirmed that she was, he said he had some work he needed done and would call on her soon to discuss it. Eleanor left the general store in a daze, not quite believing the interaction had been real. Behind her, the townspeople erupted in furious whispers and speculation. Why had Stone spoken to Eleanor Hayes of all people? What could he possibly want with the town spinster when he had ignored every beautiful young woman who had thrown herself at him? The gossips convinced themselves it must be about some practical matter, that Stone needed sewing done, and had simply asked the person who happened to be holding thread. But 2 days later, Stone appeared at Eleanor's door in the early afternoon. Freshly bathed and wearing clean clothes, carrying his hat in his hands like a nervous suitor. Eleanor invited him in, expecting him to present work shirts that needed mending, or tears and buckskin that needed repair. Instead, Stone sat in her small parlor and told her he had not really come about sewing. He said he had been watching her in the general store and had been struck by something he could not quite name, a quality in her directness and confidence that had drawn him like nothing ever had before. He asked if he could call on her properly, if she would consider spending time with him during his stay in Silver Falls so they could become better acquainted. Eleanor stared at this wealthy, handsome, legendary man and felt her first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from what must surely be a joke or a mistake. She told Stone honestly that she was 40 years old, unmarried, and considered by everyone in town to be a dried-up old maid with nothing to recommend her. She said she could not understand why a man like him would have any interest in someone like her when he could have his pick of beautiful young women. Stone's response was something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. He said that he was 46 years old and had spent the last 15 years alone in the mountains because he found most people exhausting and false. He told her that beautiful young women had thrown themselves at him for years, and every single one bored him within 5 minutes because they had nothing behind their pretty faces except eagerness to access his money. He said that in 15 minutes of conversation about thread, Eleanor had interested him more than all those women combined because she spoke with knowledge and passion about her craft, because she treated him like a regular person instead of a prize to be won, and because there was something real and substantial about her that he had been searching for without knowing it. Stone told Eleanor that society's judgment about her being unmarried at 40 said far more about society's stupidity than it did about her worth, and if she would give him a chance, he would like to discover who she really was beneath the labels other people had stuck on her. Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes as she listened to words she had never expected to hear, words that treated her not as a failure or an object of pity, but as someone valuable and interesting. She told Stone yes, she would spend time with him, and they could see what happened. Over the next 2 weeks, Stone stayed in Silver Falls longer than he ever had before, and he and Eleanor spent nearly every day together. They took long walks through the countryside, while Stone told her about life in the mountains, and Eleanor shared stories from her years of quiet observation in Silver Falls. They discovered they both loved reading and spent hours discussing books in Eleanor's parlor. Stone was fascinated by Eleanor's embroidery work and sat watching her skilled fingers create beautiful patterns while they talked about everything and nothing. Eleanor found Stone to be thoughtful and surprisingly gentle despite his rough appearance, a man who had chosen solitude not because he hated people, but because he refused to tolerate false ones. The townspeople watched this courtship with emotions ranging from disbelief to outrage to bitter envy. The young women who had been ignored by Stone could not understand how he could prefer plain, middle-aged Eleanor Hayes to them. The gossips who had mocked Eleanor for years suddenly went silent, unable to reconcile their narrative of her as a pitiable failure with the reality of the territory's most eligible bachelor courting her devotedly. On Stone's last evening in town before returning to his mountain claim, he took Eleanor to dinner at the hotel restaurant, and the entire establishment buzzed with barely concealed shock and curiosity. Stone ignored everyone except Eleanor, focusing entirely on her as they shared their meal. Afterward, he walked her home through the autumn evening, and on her front porch he took both her hands in his and told her something that made her heart stop. He said these 2 weeks with her had shown him what he had been missing all these years alone, had proven that connection and companionship were possible if you found the right person. He told Eleanor that he knew 2 weeks was not long, but at their age there was no point in playing games or pretending feelings were less than they were. Stone said he was falling in love with her and asked if she would consider marrying him and coming to live with him in the mountains. He promised her a good life, not easy because mountain living was hard, but real and full of the kind of peace that came from being exactly who you were with someone who valued you for it. Eleanor's practical side told her this was too fast, too sudden, too impossible to be real. But her heart, which had waited 40 years for something true, told her that Stone was offering exactly what she had been holding out for all this time. She told him yes, she would marry him, and Stone pulled her into his arms with a joy that made her believe in miracles. They were married 3 days later by the town preacher in a simple ceremony attended by the few genuine friends Eleanor had and witnessed by a town full of people who could not quite believe what they were seeing. The woman they had laughed at and pitied and dismissed as a failure was marrying the man every woman wanted, and she was doing it with quiet dignity and genuine happiness that made her plain face beautiful. Stone looked at his new wife like she was the most precious thing he had ever found, more valuable than all the gold in his mountain claim, and everyone who saw it understood they were witnessing something rare and real. Stone took Eleanor up to his mountain home, a surprisingly comfortable cabin he had built over the years with his own hands. Eleanor discovered she loved the mountain life, loved the peace and beauty and the freedom from society's constant judgment. She and Stone built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection that deepened into profound love as seasons passed. Eleanor's sewing skills proved invaluable as she made their cabin beautiful with curtains and quilts and clothing that kept them comfortable through harsh winters. Stone taught Eleanor to fish and hunt and survive in the wilderness, and she taught him to see beauty in small domestic details he had ignored during his years alone. They talked for hours every evening, never running out of things to discuss, and they worked side by side during the days, each contributing equally to their life together. When they came down to Silver Falls the following year for supplies, the townspeople saw a woman transformed, not in her appearance but in the light that shone from within her, the confidence of someone who knew she was cherished and valued exactly as she was. The years passed in contentment and prosperity. Stone's gold claim continued to produce wealth. But more importantly, it provided the life he and Eleanor had built together in the high peaks, where society's cruel judgments could not reach them. They had no children, but they had each other, and that was enough, and more than enough. Eleanor never forgot the years of mockery and loneliness, but she no longer felt bitterness about them because those years had taught her to value herself even when others did not, and that self-value had allowed her to recognize real love when it finally appeared. Stone often told Eleanor that finding her had been worth 15 years of loneliness, that every beautiful young woman he had ignored had been him unconsciously waiting for someone real, and Eleanor Hayes, with her plain face and extraordinary character, had been exactly what he needed. When visitors asked Stone why he had chosen Eleanor when he could have had anyone, his answer never changed. He would take Eleanor's hand and say that surface beauty fades, but substance endures, that youth passes, but character remains, and that he had waited until he was 46 to marry because he had been waiting, without knowing it, for a woman who valued herself enough to wait for something real rather than settling for something false. Eleanor lived to be 78 years old, spending 38 years married to Stone in their mountain paradise. When she died peacefully in her sleep, with Stone holding her hand, he told their neighbors that his years with Eleanor had been the greatest gift of his life, that she had transformed his lonely existence into something rich with meaning and joy. Stone lived 3 more years before joining his beloved wife, and they were buried together on the mountain they had loved. Their story became legend in Silver Falls and throughout the territory, told and retold as an example of how society's judgments are often completely wrong, how real worth has nothing to do with age or conventional beauty, and how the courage to wait for something genuine is always rewarded in the end. The townspeople who had mocked Eleanor Hayes for being single at 40 eventually understood that she had not been failing at life, but succeeding at something far more important, which was refusing to settle for less than she deserved. And when the rich mountain man everyone wanted chose the woman everyone had dismissed, he proved that true wisdom sees what shallow eyes miss, and that the greatest treasures are often the ones everyone else walks past without recognizing their value. Eleanor and Stone's love story endures as a reminder that it is never too late for happiness, that society's timeline for women's worth is arbitrary and cruel, and that the person who stays true to themselves while waiting for real love shows more courage than those who settle for false versions out of fear of being alone.